We have an exciting, useful, helpful presentation planned next. It's my pleasure to introduce two colleagues that I've had a great deal of pleasure working with over the last couple of years, Susan Clark and William Cooley from Common Knowledge. They have been our partners in the community engagement work that we've been doing with cities in San Mateo County, so many of you have known and worked with them. They are here today to talk about creating opportunities. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Thank you, Pat. Well, William and I are delighted to have this opportunity to follow up. Wasn't that an extraordinary panel? Could you please give them all a hand? We are big believers in case examples and lived experience, and that was a lot of rich wisdom. And as Peggy said, I don't think we've all together cracked the code yet on how to talk about parking and traffic, but our assignment right now is to put a little structure around those excellent examples and that wisdom to together think about, well, how can we create opportunities for understanding by neighbors? So that's our assignment. And first, for those of you who don't know Common Knowledge, we're sort of a non-traditional action research consulting firm and a real grab bag of disciplines. So my background, my formal training is in product design, behavioral economics, cross-cultural dialogue, and my colleague, William Cooley, our director of civic programs, brings a background in journalism, education, communications, and information design. And our other colleagues, together we have been refining a practice called communications for engagement. Now the first thing, and Peggy said communication is pretty important in this work, is the co in communications, right? So whenever we're working with our partners and getting information out, we're very attentive. Is the information accessible? Can people even process it? And will they comprehend it? And in addition to how people individually take in that information, how are they as a neighborhood or a community going to understand it together? Their shared understanding of the situation, and as we've noticed, they may have misunderstandings about each other. And these practices we do with an eye toward building trust and relationships has been noted. I think Serlene very beautifully called it out, that a community, a neighborhood is an ecosystem. And as you're thinking about transportation, you're thinking about the circulation and how people physically get around. We also think about the invisible circulation in a community. It's an ecosystem of how information and trust goes, and that every single communication you're doing is going to be a positive deposit in what Bill, our colleague Bill Lowell, says is the reservoir of goodwill in that community, or are your communications inadvertently drawing it down? Another way of talking about the work that we've been doing with many cities here in with Home for All is this notion of we're building community capacity so the communities can face their challenges and their opportunities to thrive. And the simpler way of describing it is we're talking about listening, learning, and leading together. Now, I became evangelical about this listening thing early on when I left my corporate marketing career, and I said instead of marketing steak sauce and Crest toothpaste and Del Monte foods, instead of trying to create an appetite for a product, I was creating an appetite for civic information and civic behavior. And I was lucky enough to work on a project to increase voting turnout among populations least likely to vote. Those are folks 18 to 40, below average education, below average income, predominantly people of color. And when we leaned into that work, yes, we asked the question you might expect, why don't you vote? But we spent way more energy on what do you care about in your community? And when we opened the conversation that way and we listened, it opened up a whole new channel of energy and insights. And those community members co-created, co-designed a project that doubled voting turnout because they had dialogues about what they cared about. And that created an appetite for hands-on, peer-led, fun voting workshops, which created an appetite for something called the Easy Voter Guide, which goes on to this day, 25 years later, produced in 5 languages, plain language about what's on the ballot. So we were thrilled to be invited to come to San Mateo County and say, well, what can we learn together by listening to neighborhoods and learning together and leading together? So our assignment today is to focus on this, how do you create opportunities for understanding by neighbors? And I'm going to do it in 4 parts. One is, let's talk about neighbors, what we think we know about neighbors, what we're assuming about neighbors. Two, what are the conditions that support learning? You're learning about them, they're learning about you. How do we make that possible? Third, as Elaine said so eloquently, you need to learn about that neighborhood. So what are their starting points? What are their stories? And fourth, then, when you got all that going, then you create your information. And we're going to land it with a very concrete tips and examples, some of which are in your handout, about designing that information for understanding. And William will lead you through an exercise. So let's talk about neighbors. As been pointed out, neighbors care about quality of life. They live there, right? So everything you're doing, you're bringing in matters. And every neighborhood is special, right? You go in, right? Every neighbor says, I'm special. It's like Lake Wobegon where all the kids are above average, right? But it's a good thing, right? Just like that voter engagement project proved, the people they thought were apathetic, no, they cared. It's a good thing that neighbors care about their neighborhood. You don't have to worry about the relevance problem. Now what happens is, well, maybe people show they care in different ways, right? So maybe they're posting on next door, or maybe somehow that they've got in their head that your project is a threat, and their job is to care about their neighborhood by defending against that threat. Or maybe there are people out there improving quality of life in the neighborhood. They're not showing up at your meetings. They're busy being the crossing guard. They're busy being that favorite soccer coach or the one everybody turns to at the school, right? Those folks care about their neighborhood, and you need to understand where that caring flows. Now, you've had different experiences. Who here has gotten a nasty gram on Nextdoor or been called some names? I know, I've heard some of your stories, right? So, what are your expectations for neighbors, right? I understand. You've had those experiences. Some of you are telling us about the experiences that happened to you 12 years ago and you're still holding on to it. Yes, it hurts, right? So what would be the natural thing to do is get a bit defensive or kind of go into that bureaucratic process place, right? I'm going to wrap myself in the lingo language on this one. We have a right to do this process and we got to do it this way. But what does that do for that reservoir of goodwill or that relationship? No. All right, well then you may hope the neighbors are like this. All right, the Vulcans, wouldn't it be great? They could just be Excel formulas and we'd drop in the data and out would come the same conclusion I came to. Wouldn't that be great? But actually not, right? When you're working with a community, again, there are helpful and hopeful elements. So you don't want to take out the heart that Serlene was talking about. You work with the positive emotions. All right, so our assignment is creating opportunities for understanding. Well, what is it that you're trying to help people understand? You have different projects, but we would assume it's something along this line. You're going in saying, where are we? What is the project? What is the status? How do we get here? There's always some history, right? We've heard about the history. Give people the context. How can neighbors get involved? You're going to present this where they're in the picture, right? This isn't you talking about you and your project. They are in this picture. How can they get involved? And always, how can they learn more? So how do we create the conditions that they can take this information in? Well, this is a diagram, very simplified, of the human brain. And we talk about the physiology of community trust. Are you going into a neighborhood where people feel like they've had things done to them, right? So people are reacting. And you need to know, is it that kind of situation? Or you may be thinking, but we're doing this for them. This neighborhood needs this. Isn't it great? We can do this for them. Well, as you've been heard this morning, it's the doing with. So being attentive to what are the conditions under which individually and collectively the nervous system of that neighborhood can digest your information. And you may be cast already as the villain, and how do you get out of that? Or you might say, no, I want to be the hero. Well, I wouldn't get myself cast as the hero either, especially not prematurely, because you can't, your project, no matter how great, can't carry everybody's complete hopes and fears. So instead of it being about you, it's got to be about the neighborhood. And you're going to start, again, the conditions for creating learning is thinking about, well, what do folks need to know? So something's happening in their neighborhood. Well, people are going to want to know, how is this going to affect my current living situation? How will it impact my quality of life? And I think you understand that. But oftentimes people may not realize, in our experience, community members care just as much about the neighborhood as a whole. It isn't just their self-interest. They want to know, how's this going to impact the things that make the neighborhood special? Maybe their particular challenges. Will this be making the challenge, meet the challenges well, or making them worse? And then finally, yes, the part that you were ready to share with them is my project, my plan, right? So what's happening on what time frame? But even then, neighbors need to know who's representing our interests. Do we trust that? And so I've asked my table mates at table 2 to give us an example of some comments. William from Sonoma was once a journalist, always a journalist, was out listening for quotes in the community. And we have examples of what were actual quotes when people thought about this particular property in Sonoma.
Are they finally doing anything with the old car dealership?
I've heard they're going to put up some townhomes and small grocery store.
I heard that the development is currently in its second round of EIR hearings before the Planning Commission. Apparently, the developer's proposed mitigation measures won't adequately address issues raised by the updated traffic study.
I remember when that lot was a grove of oak trees.
So William will tell, those are all actual quotes, and the one that Bill read was from the vice mayor. So there are people, who think in terms of that blue category, but the vast majority of other folks are just thinking like neighbors about their neighborhood. So people are multidimensional. Who here has actually been out listening to the community and people who say things that are absolutely contradictory? They want up, they want down, right? Okay. What you need to do is listen beneath the surface, right? There's a time when you're going to be super literal and technical in other parts of your work. Great. When you're out with community, listening literally is going to make you frustrated and them frustrated. What you're doing, you're listening with friendly focus. It's like when I take off my eyeglasses. Friendly focus, right? And so, but you're, you know, I think all of us in our lives have said things that, you know, it's like, because there's a hurt, there's a fear, there's that, you know, what's happening in my heart? And you listen for that. And you make it okay that people share concerns, because neighborhoods have challenges. And if we make topics off limits, or we say, well, you know, we can't talk about this, we can't talk about that, how is that going to work on building that relationship and building that trust? So common concerns and hopes. You've already heard fantastic examples. Yes, traffic is a shared source of frustration. You'd be crazy to go in and say, yeah, we got this covered, right? You'd be just putting a big target on yourself. Instead, yeah, people want to get around more easily. Parking and congestion are deeply personal. Remember we talked about the nervous system of the neighborhood? Yeah, this is, you know, Supervisor Slocum couldn't get out of his, you know, these are stressors. They are real, and to pretend otherwise would not be helpful. And yet, in the heart of these challenges, these very real challenges, are things that we hear over and over, that people want diverse, walkable, connected communities. So you can hold both things at once, right? It isn't that it's an all bad problem or all good. What we find with community members, they have a tremendous potential for ambiguity. And the more that you acknowledge the range of the positive, the negative, all at once, you are building trust. You are credible. Now, here's a peek under the hood. So the folks that have been working with us on the community engagement project have seen this diagram, but we call it phased mutual learning. So you are learning about the neighborhood and they are learning about your project, and it happens concurrently. And on the left side is where we're bringing in more and more people for community outreach, and we have a whole nother learning network activity on the learning outreach, and there are now so many more examples as a result of the Home for All community engagement pilots of ways to disprove the apathy myth. People care when you ask what you care about in the community. And as you're bringing them in, you are over time helping them learn about the project, and you're learning about them till you get to that shared understanding. And the point that was brought up in the panel, the why. Why is this happening? Make sure that you're all on the same page about the why before you dive deep into the what. And the more that you build that sort of golden egg of shared understanding, the more you'll find, as Emily Beach shared, that not everybody is going to have to stick with you. Don't feel like this is a forced march and everybody has to go to the end and read that EIR. No, give people the choice. If they feel good enough, they'll think you're smart if you understand the neighborhood well. That's what makes you smart to them. And if they trust that you've done that, then people can self-select who goes all the way through. So, take-home point about conditions. People won't care what you know until they know that you. Thank you. So just if you care about the community, they care about the community. You're already standing on common ground in that neighborhood, and you're building that reservoir of goodwill. Okay. So now, as we've heard, you really need to learn about the neighborhood. So we would say you need to understand the language preferences, the education level, the civic exposure, and the lived experience that people have. Now, who may come out for your project? The folks, the 4 to 6 who are engaged in everything, right? Does that mean you've learned the neighborhood? Okay. Oh, I know. We're going to have the people against the project and people for the project. So we got it covered, right? I got pro-con. Is that the neighborhood? No. So first thing you want to do is make sure you have actually looked at the demographics of that neighborhood, that community, and understand the population. So we have a slide here, but American Community Survey, you have other data sources. And this also, if you find that there's a particular element in the community that wants to hold the whole mic in the conversation, you together have this objective data. No, we need to get the whole neighborhood in on this. And as been mentioned, you need to consider language and literacy levels. This was a slide left over from last year, just a way to shout out to our first 4 pilot cities. But what is the foreign-born population? What are the language preferences? And we also really encourage you to understand the literacy levels, the educational attainment. It's a little harder to find like a snap judgment, educational attainment thing, but you can, as a proxy, look at high school attainment, college degrees, and understand. Always we recommend plain language. Like that Easy Voter Guide I mentioned, we got just as much fan mail from the PhDs and the busy professionals because people like plain language. But there are some communities where you are doing yourself and them a disservice if you are not attentive to the need to attend to reading levels. All right, so now you know who's in the neighborhood, and you're getting into that interactive part of understanding this story. And so the experiences, as already been said with the great examples before, their hopes, their concerns. What do they know? What do they know about your project? What don't they know yet? And what are key concepts? So for instance, a good example of the key concept that people might make assumptions about parking because they live in a single family home and they don't understand parking in multifamily homes. Whatever are those key concepts that helps people understand. So you're now going to, with this understanding of the right conditions and the neighborhood and their starting points, you're going to actually get to designing the actual information, all right? And so first thing is maximize accessibility. So you're designing for the broadest audience possible, right? Not just the self-appointed, self-anointed who like to show up sometimes. The key facts that you know are going to be important to comprehension of your project. Plain language, we've got more details about that in the handout. And please minimize technical language. Just even the word mitigations, right? It's common, right? Mitigation sounds like your project has a disease or something. I'm like, you can come up with other ways of talking about adjustments, compensations, additions, and so forth. So just be sensitive to that. And if you're not certain about, well, it's my language, work with community partners, and then we've got a whole other module about that. But don't assume that you have to figure it all out yourself. There are people in the community who want to help you increase comprehension. So in addition to the information being accessible, how are people going to understand it? Well, in some cases, like podium parking, would a visual have helped that gentleman, right? Or in some cases, you need a 3D model. Site visits, walking tours. People are kinesthetic learners. They like to learn by talking. We've talked about the trusted partners. This is one of our favorite examples. Redwood City, hey Alex, went to Casa Circolo Cultural, and there were some concepts that need to be understood, and they did the whole meeting in Spanish and understood ways to simplify, which in fact enhanced their subsequent bilingual meeting for the English speakers as well. Create opportunities for people to ask questions, right? Some of you may be in very technical fields where You're used to getting your information and learning things through print, right? Or some of you like online modules. I do. But most people, especially if it's something that's very complicated, that ability to talk person to person, to ask questions is very important. And a final point on this comprehension, again, with a shout out back to frameworks, you may encounter some misinformation out in the community, right? Has this ever happened to anybody? All right. So you're like, well, your facts are bad. I'm going to use my facts. But don't let the fact versus facts get people into factions. Really, it's just, and we don't live in a post-fact society. We don't. We just live in a society where if you try and take it on as a slugfest and fight theirs, you may inadvertently reinforce the misinformation and instead step back. Remember, we got this home base. We're standing on common ground. We care about the community. And we can find the appropriate time to get the correct information out. And now I'm going to hand it over to William Cooley, who's going to explain the final concept before our exercise.
Thanks so much. As Susan was saying, throughout this process, what we're trying to do at this stage, once we have done the listening, we kind of understand people's starting points, we're learning more about what they care about, is we're trying to design information that's accessible to all people in the community. But we also know that as we're listening, that people don't have the same starting points. Right? They all bring different backgrounds, different information, different experiences. So what we found is really helpful is to think about this idea of tiers of information and really being intentional about kind of what tier information might fall into. So at the base, we want to build from a sense of introductory information, right? So what is something that everyone in the community, or everyone in the neighborhood in this case, might need to know? This is really important also when thinking about audiences that may have been minimally engaged or are new to the topic. We're really attentive to ask people what their previous exposure is or previous experience. And so what we find is that these audiences really benefit from that background information. They need the context. Everyone benefits from history, but in particular, if you're trying to bring people on board, we want to give them information that empowers them to be able to participate, to be able to talk about the topic in a way that, again, doesn't make them feel left behind. For moderately engaged people, so people who may have attended some meetings in the past or expressed interest, we talk about information at the intermediate level. So that's details, examples that allow them to go a little bit more in depth, deepen their understanding. This is the type of information that we would say that some people need to know, but maybe it isn't necessary for everyone. And then, as Susan was mentioning, at the advanced level, we use the phrase highly engaged community members. We find that that's a good neutral way to talk about the both, of course, formally appointed and self-appointed planning commissioners. You have some folks who are really, really eager. They want to dive into the policy specifics. They want to see your draft ordinance because they want to redline it. They want to pore over kind of the appendices. They want to look at the math. They want to make sure the engineering checks out. And we also know that, again, San Mateo County, your communities have really diverse experiences. And so there are folks who bring deep backgrounds on technical issues. They may have technical expertise and have contributions. And so we want to be, again, mindful of that audience as well. So to kind of practice this, in a second, what your table facilitator is going to do is pass out a series of tiles of a little packet. And the tiles feature just different pieces of sample communications. Some of them are pulled directly from different cities here in San Mateo County. Some of them are pulled from the region. Others are from elsewhere in the country. And what we want you to do is to practice with a partner. So you'll work with someone else. This isn't a solo activity. Is to sort them into those categories of introductory, intermediate, and advanced. Thinking about, given this example, given what we've just talked about, where should this go? And we want you to think about these guiding questions, because again, the importance of doing this with a partner is that we want you to talk it out. There may be some cases where you disagree, or you think, oh, it's kind of tough to decide. As you go through, think, is it accessible to a broad audience, right? Or is it something that only a real narrow group in the community might be interested in? Who would be interested in this information? Is it really that highly engaged group, the self-appointed planning commissioner? Or is it a neighborhood or someone who's living down the street from a development? And then lastly, that really important guiding question that we use to determine if it is in that introductory category, is it something that all people in the neighborhood need to know? If you feel very strongly about that, I would say that's a good indication that we put it in the introductory category. And so in terms of time, I know, Pat, we've had some adjustments. What time do we want to come back together? Okay. All right, so I will turn it over to the table facilitators. Oh, thank you, everyone. And sorry to pull you away if you're still working. It is A-okay. I appreciate the thoughtfulness. I didn't have a chance to circulate around the entire room, but heard some very good discussion. I won't say debate, but definitely some good dialogue around kind of where to put these things. Being that we're in this type of room, people are often interested, like, did I get it right? If you want to know for sure, raise your hand. I'll come around and check in with you later. But as I shared with a couple of folks, there is intentionally some ambiguity with these, that they could go in different categories. And what we really want to make sure is that you have an opportunity to talk with your partner, also with your table, about kind of this experience and thinking about these different levels. Levels are not absolute. These things all exist on a continuum. So what we want to do is give you some time with your table to talk about the experience. So how was the partner exercise? What stood out to you? And also to think about how this idea of tiering information can relate to your own professional experience. So how do you and your organization present information to the public? And also, how could you present information more at that introductory level? Thinking specifically also about occasions, maybe right now where information tends to be more intermediate or a little bit more advanced. So how can we infuse or add some introductory information to those opportunities? So with this, what we'll do is we'll take about 10 minutes. We'll come back together. And if we have time for a few questions, we'll do that then. Thanks so much. All right. I apologize for cutting you off. It always makes me feel bad, especially when we're having great discussions like this. But we want to be respectful of time and have a chance to just quickly wrap this up. What we had hoped to do was have some time for questions and also just sharing of everything that's been said around the room. But I was going around listening just because help make things a little bit faster. Heard some really good discussion. Some great reasons also for why maybe you made certain choices when we did that sorting activity. And also got to hear a lot about what people's experiences are in terms of their own organization and how they present information at different levels. So a few things just as takeaways I wanted to share with the whole group because I thought they were particularly good comments, is that graphics need to be contextualized. That you might have a graphic and you think, oh, this is really accessible, it's great, we have things labeled. You might still need a description to go with it. Sometimes simple is not accessible, right? Simple does not mean accessible. Don't be afraid to add more information if it enhances understanding. Don't also assume that elected and appointed officials are all at the advanced level. It's not meant to be a laugh line, but I know you all chuckle with love. Is that, information that we give to anyone at the city, be the appointed staff or otherwise, everyone benefits from introductory information. If only also for the fact that it gives you much easier talking points and examples to point to when reaching out to constituents. If we can explain it to everyone, you can explain it to anyone. And then lastly, I heard one thing from a person who is a nonprofit leader talking about the importance of reaching out beyond their organization. So if you within your city or you within your organization feel like you're not sure what level the information is at, reach out to another partner, reach out to a client, reach out to a community member, ask them, and they will be hopefully very honest with you in most cases. With that, I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Thank you, William. And thank you all for digging into that exercise. We are very interested in what that additionally whipped up for you, what thoughts, what questions. We know your table facilitators are collecting it. The great thing about Home for All is this isn't the end of this conversation. It is a continuation of a conversation. And with the wisdom and the smarts in this room, this is the team that can co-create some real concrete peer-to-peer solutions on this parking and traffic. And I just want to underscore using partners. Some electeds are actually and staff members are so in the advanced, they don't even know how to dial back to the introductory, right? Right? So it goes both ways. So how do you get that clear-eyed view? You work with partners in the community. And again, sometimes when you use partners, people are like, oh, I have to go get an MOU. No, you're making friends, right? So informal relationships are really part of the powerful magic. So I think the final thing is William and I both want to express our gratitude for being able to work not just with Home for All, but the whole fantastic multi-sector network that they've developed. And I do want to give a shout out. When I mentioned that Easy Voter Guide project, Supervisor Slocum was elections chief and was one of the boosters that early on, so thank you. And so you all know that you're here in San Mateo County between San Francisco and San Jose. And if you hear disruptive innovation one more time, you're going to, right. So, but you're disrupting the status quo of kind of that us, them, and things have to be fights. You're doing that, and you're doing that by bridging innovation. And that is what we do. You can disrupt by doing things a different way, asking new questions. But the bridging role that the panel so beautifully talked about, that is what you're doing together. And we're really confident that you've got the answers for this particular next phase of the work. How do we land the best kind of collaborative communications at the neighborhood level? Thank you for the chance to spend the morning with you.
Let's give another hand to Susan and William. Thank you.